Every morning in our apartment starts the same way. I'm the first to wake up, pulling on my favorite shorts and tank top before heading to the kitchen to make breakfast. There's something soothing in the routine. Heating up the pan, slicing the vegetables, listening to the quiet sizzle of the oil. Everything seems so ordinary, but deep down I've been feeling like something isn't right. David, as always, is sitting at the table, buried in his laptop. His work consumes him entirely. He barely looks up, throwing me the usual phrases, "How did you sleep?" or "Is breakfast ready?" I answer him in the same casual tone, but inside I'm torn, craving something more, something personal, something that would remind me that we're still a couple, that our connection is alive. But it never comes. He doesn't even notice that I hardly smile anymore, that my eyes don't light up when I look at him. We speak as if we've memorized our lines, just repeating them every day. But this routine no longer brings me any peace or happiness. At some point during breakfast, my phone chimes softly. I glance at the screen and see Jack's name. David's brother has always been a good friend to me. We've often exchanged messages, joking, sharing news. But lately his texts have changed. Today he wrote, "How do you look today?" That simple sentence makes me pause. I realize that there's something different in those words. It's not just a friendly compliment, it's something more. My hand freezes mid-reach for my cup, and I feel something inside me respond to that message. Those few words warm me in a way I haven't felt from David in a long time. My heart starts beating faster, and I realize that this warmth is what I've been missing for so long. David doesn't even notice my reaction. He's too absorbed in his work, too caught up in his own world. I look at him and realize there's a growing distance between us. And now, with Jack reminding me that I can still be important and desired by someone, I start to question whether David and I can ever be the same again. Today I paid extra attention to what I wore before heading to work. For some reason, I felt the urge to put on something more striking, something that accentuated my figure. I chose a tight skirt and a blouse with a deep neckline. In the mirror, I saw a woman who perhaps wanted to be noticed. The only question was, by whom? The workday at the salon started as usual. Clients, phone calls, appointments. I went through the motions, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Jack. He hadn't messaged me this morning like he used to. But now our messages had become more frequent, and I found myself looking forward to them. My phone vibrated in my skirt pocket, and I immediately felt a small surge of excitement. I opened the message. It was from Jack. "How's your day? I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the last time I saw you." I froze. His words reached deep inside me, stirring something that made me forget where I was for a moment. "You know you're stunning, right?" Another message from him. I could almost hear his voice in my head. This wasn't just harmless flirting anymore. A slight tremor ran through my fingers as I considered how to respond. This didn't feel like our usual friendly banter. It was something new, something dangerous. At that moment, I realized Jack didn't just see me as a friend anymore. His attention had become too blatant, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just words, my reaction betrayed me. My heart raced, and there was a strange pull in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about his messages. On one hand, I felt guilty towards David. He didn't deserve this. But on the other hand, these emotions, this thrill, this desire, it was too real to ignore. How long would I resist this inner conflict? Every time I told myself to stop, that this couldn't go any further, I immediately imagined the next step. Another message from Jack arrived. "Want to meet? Let's grab a coffee after work." I felt the ground slipping from beneath my feet. Things were moving too fast, and I didn't know where it might lead. My hand hovered over my phone screen. Should I say yes or no? I hesitated, feeling myself being drawn into a dangerous game, one I wasn't sure I could escape from anymore. I sat at a small table in a cozy cafe, staring out the window, trying to hide my nervousness. Outside, life went on as usual. People rushed by, cars moved through the rain-slicked streets. But here, inside, time seemed to slow down. My heart was racing faster than normal, and I struggled to keep my thoughts together. When the door opened and Jack walked in, a light wave of nervousness washed over me. He looked as though there was nothing unusual about our meeting, but I knew it was far from simple. With every step he took toward me, I felt more certain that this conversation was going to change something important. "Hey," he smiled as he sat down across from me. I nodded in return, trying to appear calm, but the tension inside was hard to ignore. We placed our order, and for a while we just talked about everyday things, as though there wasn't this undercurrent of electricity between us. When the waiter brought our coffee, Jack suddenly fell silent. I felt his gaze linger on my hands, nervously fidgeting with the spoon. Then he sighed, leaned on the table, and said the words that completely floored me. "Lauren, I've been meaning to tell you something for a long time." His voice was soft, but there was something unsettling in it. "I've always had feelings for you. I know it's wrong, but I can't hide it anymore." My heart skipped a beat. I froze, not knowing how to react. His words echoed in my mind, stirring up a whirlwind of emotions I had long tried to suppress. I couldn't believe he'd said it. Jack, my husband's brother, admitted he had always wanted to be with me. I don't know what to say," I finally managed to utter, feeling something awaken inside me. Shock, excitement, guilt, it all merged into one. He leaned closer and his hand gently touched mine. The gesture was so unexpected and yet so natural that I felt my pulse quicken. His touch was warm, and I couldn't ignore what it triggered in me. My hand trembled, but I didn't pull away. "I can't deny my feelings for you, Lauren," he said quietly, his voice reaching into every corner of my consciousness. "I've always dreamed of being with you, but I understand that it's complicated. I'm willing to wait as long as it takes." Every word resonated in my soul, stirring fear and desire all at once. I looked at him, trying to process what was happening in my mind. I couldn't just say no, but inside a battle raged. I was still resisting, knowing where this could lead. But it was like a magnet. The more I tried to pull away, the stronger the pull toward him became. "This is wrong, Jack," I whispered, feeling my voice betray me. "We can't." But my words lacked conviction, as though I didn't believe them myself. Jack didn't pull his hand away, and his gaze remained locked on my face. In that moment, I realized that something had formed between us, something I could no longer deny. I lay next to David in our bed, feeling incredibly lonely despite his physical presence. The soft glow of the bedside lamp barely illuminated the room, but even in the dim light, it was clear that we were worlds apart. I wore my favorite lace lingerie, hoping it would somehow catch his attention. But as usual, his thoughts were consumed by work. The bright screen of his laptop shone between us like a barrier, making the distance between us even more tangible. He barely noticed me. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, his eyes scanning lines of text, and I knew that something inside me had broken. The distance between us had become so palpable it felt physical. There used to be a time when lying beside him made me feel safe, loved. Now there was only coldness and emptiness. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and automatically opened the Messenger app. Jack was online. My fingers started typing without much thought. "What are you up to?" It was silly, but I just wanted some kind of emotional closeness. A few seconds later, his reply came. "Thinking about you." Those 3 words warmed me in a way I hadn't felt with David in a long time. My heart began to beat faster. I stared at the screen, unable to believe how much this conversation had come to mean to me. Jack was the one who noticed me, who cared, who saw more in me than just his brother's wife. And no matter what I tried to tell myself, this wasn't just innocent flirting anymore. "Why aren't I with you?" His message made me pause. I looked at David, his focused face, and realized that more and more of my thoughts were with Jack. David had no idea what was going on inside my head. His world was completely disconnected from mine. I could feel a real emotional connection forming between Jack and me. With every message, with every conversation, I was sinking deeper into this feeling. My internal struggle grew stronger. I knew this was crossing a line. I tried to convince myself it was just a game, that it wasn't serious, but with each passing day it became harder to believe that. Lying next to David, I realized that I no longer felt the connection that had once bound us together. All that remained was routine and habit, but with Jack, I felt alive. Every time he messaged me, it was like a breath of fresh air. I put the phone back on the nightstand, knowing I was stepping into a dangerous situation from which there might be no return. but how could I resist something that made me feel alive? I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind was already elsewhere, not with David. I was already with Jack. When my shift ended and I stepped into the parking lot, the evening air was cool, but not too cold. I paused for a moment, enjoying the freshness after a long day, but my thoughts were far from here. I couldn't stop thinking about Jack, about our recent conversations, about how quickly things had escalated between us. Then I saw a car pull up to the curb. It was Jack. He lowered the window, smiling as he nodded toward me. "Lauren, want to ride home?" His voice was so calm and confident, as if this was nothing out of the ordinary. But inside me, everything was swirling. I hesitated for a second before walking to the car. In a moment, I was inside, feeling the tension of the small space between us tightening everything inside of me. We barely spoke as he pulled the car onto the road. I didn't know how to start the conversation, but there was too much unspoken between us already. After a few minutes of silence, Jack suddenly said, "I have to say it again. I can't stop thinking about you, Lauren. You know this isn't just casual, right?" I held my breath. He stopped the car at a red light and his hand rested on mine. His touch was warm, and I felt a surge of emotions wash over me once again. I turned to him, our eyes met, and in that moment I knew I couldn't hold back any longer. I can't ignore this, Jack," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my contradictions. "I can't pretend there's nothing between us." He leaned in closer, and as if guided by some unspoken signal, our lips met. The kiss was soft yet full of passion, as though this connection had always existed between us, but only now were we brave enough to acknowledge it. I felt a tremor run through my body, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed like Jack could hear it. This wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was something more. I knew that after this step there would be no going back. When our lips finally parted, I looked into his eyes and whispered, "I could never have imagined you wanted it so badly." He stared back at me, and in his gaze there was everything: desire, passion, uncertainty about the future. But I knew one thing: this moment had changed everything. Our connection had become more serious, and now, even if I wanted to, I wouldn't be able to return to the life I had before. Work at the salon carried on as usual, but I could feel the tension building inside me. What used to be ordinary days had turned into real trials. Every morning I woke up thinking that maybe these feelings would fade, that everything would go back to normal, but instead things were only getting worse. My relationship with Jack was no longer just flirting. It had become something more, something dangerous, and I realized I was being pulled deeper into it. I often replayed moments in my head that now seemed like warning signs. One evening I found his forgotten sunglasses at our house. I managed to hide them, but it felt too close to being exposed. And then there was the text I almost sent while David was next to me. He glanced at my phone by accident, and I froze, feeling my heart pound in my chest. Luckily, he didn't suspect anything, but that moment lingered in the air like a warning bell dot. At the salon, I tried to focus on my work, but thoughts of Jack wouldn't leave me. I knew this could all lead to disaster, but my emotions were stronger than reason. And it was during this time that Jack started to demand more. His messages became more insistent, his requests more blatant. He wanted to spend more time with me, but I knew the situation was becoming dangerous. "We need to meet more," he texted me one day. I felt a tightness in my chest as I read those words. On one hand, I wanted to be with him, to feel him close. But on the other, I knew that if I kept going, everything would spiral out of control. My phone vibrated on the table again, and I saw his name flash on the screen. "When will you be free? I need to see you." I stared at the message, trying to find the words to delay the meeting. Inside, I was torn apart by contradictions. Jack was becoming too demanding, and it scared me. But what scared me even more was that part of me was willing to take that risk. I started noticing how our relationship had changed. It was no longer a secret pleasure. It had turned into something darker, something dangerous. With each meeting, I sank deeper into these feelings, and the fear of being caught became unbearable. I knew this couldn't last forever, but Jack wasn't willing to stop. He wanted more, and every time I tried to put off our meetings, he only became more insistent. At the end of the day, I was still at work, but my mind was far away. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. There was something in my eyes that I hadn't seen before, fear and desire all at once. I knew the situation was slipping out of control, but I couldn't stop. The secret pleasure that once brought me joy had now become a trap. The past few weeks had become a real test for me. Secret meetings with Jack, tense messages, trying to hide our relationship from David. All of it had consumed me entirely. But the further I went, the more my guilt and fear of being exposed grew. During the day, I tried to live my normal life, but at night, as soon as I closed my eyes, nightmares began to haunt me. One night, after an especially stressful day, I had a terrifying dream. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by loved ones, family, friends, colleagues. Their faces were twisted with shock and judgment, and the air was thick with tense silence. David stood directly in front of me, his eyes blazing with anger and pain. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" His voice was so loud it felt like the whole world could hear him. "You betrayed me. Us." I tried to say something, but the words were stuck in my throat. My body trembled and I couldn't move. Everyone's eyes were on me, condemning and relentless. My secret was no longer a secret, everyone knew. David had exposed everything, and now I stood here naked before their contempt. "How could you?" His voice grew quieter, but each word hit its mark. "How could you betray our family?" I couldn't bear his gaze that terrible moment. I turned to Jack, who stood off to the side, but he did nothing, said nothing. He just stood there, distant, as if he had nothing to do with it. I was alone. At that moment, I woke up. My chest was heaving, my breath short and ragged. My heart pounded like I had just run out of that nightmare. I was in our bed, the room dark and still. I sat up suddenly, struggling to understand that it had only been a dream. Cold sweat covered my body, and I instinctively looked at David. He was peacefully asleep beside me, his breathing calm and steady. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down, but the image from the dream still haunted me. It was just a nightmare, I told myself, but the fear that had pierced me in my sleep didn't go away. It stayed with me, lodged deep in my soul. I knew that if the truth ever came out, it would be just like what I had seen in the dream. I lay back down, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with thoughts of how close I was to losing everything. Every day felt risky. Every meeting with Jack brought me closer to possible exposure. Now that fear had become my constant shadow, haunting me not only in my sleep, but also while awake. David rolled over onto his other side, his hand brushing mine by accident. I flinched at the unexpected touch, as if he could somehow know my betrayal just by that contact. I lay still, not daring to move even the slightest, afraid it might somehow give me away. But he continued sleeping, completely unaware. Eventually, I got out of bed and went to the kitchen, where I poured myself a glass of water. I stared at my reflection in the window. It looked pale and exhausted. I couldn't control this fear anymore. It was becoming too strong, too real. Even when no one was around, I still felt the judgmental stares, just like in the dream. The workshop had always been a place of calm. Here I could find refuge from everything happening around me. The sounds of work, the rustle of paper, the clink of tools, the faint smell of paint gave me a sense of stability. But even here in my sanctuary, I couldn't shake the growing feeling that my life was slowly spiraling out of control. Jack. He was becoming more demanding. With each meeting, each conversation, his words grew more authoritative. He kept saying I needed to leave David. His words felt like a command. "He doesn't deserve someone like you. You should be with me." I set my brush down on the table and took a deep breath. Thoughts of Jack wouldn't leave me. He truly cared for me. His attention made me feel alive, but something about his behavior had started to frighten me. His jealousy was growing. In the past few weeks, he began asking who I was talking to, checking up on me, questioning where I was and what I was doing. He demanded more time, more of my attention, as if we had crossed a line where everything had to be under his control. "Did you talk to anyone else?" This question had started to appear in his messages more often, and every time I replied that everything was fine, he wasn't satisfied. His jealousy turned into suspicion, and it began to weigh on me. He wanted me to fully dedicate myself to him, and every step I took away from that drew his discontent. I recalled how he once snapped, "You can't stay with David. I won't tolerate you wasting your time on him." Those words shocked me. Things hadn't been this way before. Our relationship had been light. It felt like we were just enjoying each other. But now it had become something darker. Jack was no longer the man I could flirt with without worrying about consequences. He had become demanding, his jealousy seeping into every conversation. I felt like I was losing myself in this relationship. I was trying to balance my life with David and what I had with Jack. But now, it had become nearly impossible. Jack wasn't giving me space to breathe. His demands were growing, and I was starting to panic. He was checking up on me, questioning me, and his control over me was becoming suffocating. I picked up my phone and saw a new message from him. "Why aren't you answering? Are you with someone?" My heart froze. I couldn't take this pressure anymore, but at the same time I was afraid that if I stopped responding, things would escalate even further. The internal conflict was intensifying with each passing day, and I no longer knew how to cope with it. Jack wanted me to completely break things off with David. He spoke about it openly, insisting that David didn't deserve me, that I was wasting my life. I began doubting myself and my decisions. Maybe Jack was right? But every time I thought about it, something inside me screamed, "Stop, don't rush." I knew that my relationship with Jack was crossing boundaries. It was no longer just an infatuation. It had become a real dependence on his attention, his validation. And now that dependence was starting to suffocate me. I couldn't ignore the warning signs any longer. Everything that was happening had become too dangerous, and I felt like time was running out. After work, I stood in the parking lot for what felt like forever, unable to make myself go home. My shift had ended, my colleagues were long gone, but I couldn't force myself to get in the car. Thoughts about Jack consumed me. His jealousy, his control, it was all becoming too much, yet I found myself drawn to him. It was as if there was a force pulling me toward him, one I couldn't resist, even though I knew things had gone too far. I started the car and drove to his place. The drive seemed endless, with every red light giving me a moment to reconsider. But I knew I had to see him, not because it was the right thing to do, but because I couldn't hold myself back anymore. These meetings with Jack had become more than just fleeting moments. They had become something I couldn't ignore. When I knocked on his door and he opened it, his gaze was filled with tension and desire. Jack reached out to pull me in, and I followed, even as a sense of unease grew inside me. "We need to talk, Jack," I said as the door closed behind me. "You're becoming too controlling. This isn't normal." His face grew serious. His eyes darkened. "I just want to be with you, Lauren. Why is that so hard for you?" His voice had a sharper edge. "I want you to leave David. You know it's the right thing to do." I stepped back, feeling the tension between us building. His words were demanding, and it frightened me. "You're asking for too much," I said, trying to stay calm. "I can't just leave everything behind. You're becoming jealous of every little thing, and that's not what I want." Jack stepped closer, his voice growing tighter. "Because I can't stand the thought of you being with him. He doesn't deserve you." I felt the conflict within me rising. We were both on the edge, but instead of backing away, I stepped forward, almost as if on instinct. "You don't understand," I began. But before I could finish, he pulled me to him with a sudden force. Our lips crashed together with the intensity we had both been holding back for too long. This kiss wasn't just an expression of emotion. It was a burst of passion we could no longer contain. Everything that had been holding us back crumbled in an instant. I couldn't control myself anymore, and every second became more intense. Jack held me tightly, his movements urgent, insistent. I responded with equal intensity. We couldn't stop. Our hands moved frantically over each other, our lips never parting. We were caught in this wild attraction that neither of us could hold back. We reached the bed and Jack lowered me onto it, never letting go. In that moment, nothing else existed. It was pure, unrestrained passion. All our arguments, our doubts, our fears, everything disappeared, leaving only this night, filled with overwhelming desire. I couldn't resist what was happening between us any longer. It was inevitable. Every touch, every kiss only heightened the intensity. We gave ourselves over to the moment completely, sinking deeper with each movement. I felt myself being swept away in this whirlwind of emotion, every second charged with wild, uncontrollable desire. But with each passing minute, another feeling grew inside me. Guilt. I knew that this was spiraling out of control, that I was losing myself in this relationship. The night was full of passion, but I realized I could no longer control my emotions. Even if I wanted to stop, I couldn't anymore. I lay next to Jack in his apartment. The night was quiet, and Jack was already asleep, his breathing calm and steady. But inside, I felt like I was losing control. Every passing moment made me realize that things had spiraled far beyond what I could manage. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down, but the sense of unease wouldn't leave me. Meanwhile, across the city, David sat in his hotel room when his phone rang. It was his mother. Her voice was filled with concern. "David, I can't reach Jack. He's not answering. Is everything okay with him?" "Don't worry, Mom, I'll check," David replied, trying to reassure her, though a sense of worry began to grow inside him. After the call ended, he opened the app they had all started using years ago. Back then, David had suggested they connect their phones, not only with Jack, but also with Lauren, so they could always know where each other was. He had almost forgotten about it, but now, feeling increasingly uneasy, he decided to check Jack's location. When he saw where Jack was, his heart froze. Jack was home, but that wasn't all. Lauren was there with him. That detail hit him like a punch. Lauren, at Jack's apartment in the middle of the night? Could it really be? Memories of her recent disappearances, her evasive explanations began to form a terrifying picture in his mind. Inside him, a storm was brewing. This betrayal was unimaginable. Without wasting a moment, David booked the first flight back, and within hours was on his way. During the entire flight, his mind fixated on one thing. What was really happening? How could his life have fallen apart so suddenly? Why would Lauren betray him? When David burst into Jack's apartment in the middle of the night, full of fury, he saw them immediately. Lauren and Jack lying in bed together. The scene before him seemed frozen in time. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. How could you?" His voice cracked as he struggled to get the words out. His eyes were filled with pain and anger. Lauren jumped out of bed the moment she saw him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words were stuck in her throat. Jack sat up as well, unsure of what to say. "David, let me explain," Lauren pleaded, her voice shaking, but David couldn't hear her anymore. His world was falling apart, and rage consumed him. Suddenly, unable to control his anger, he grabbed the nearest lamp and hurled it against the wall with all his strength. Glass shattered across the room, covering the floor in shards. Then he rushed toward a nearby cabinet, toppling it over, and began breaking everything in his path. Books, chairs, anything he could get his hands on. Lauren ran to him, desperately trying to stop him. "Please, David, wait," she cried, trying to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. "You were my wife," David shouted, not paying attention to her words. "How could you do this to me?" Jack stood up as well, but when he tried to intervene, David shoved him aside. "You were my brother," David roared, full of rage and pain. "How could you do this?" Lauren stood back, realizing it was all over. Anything she could say now felt meaningless. David's anger and disappointment left no room for explanations. Everything she had hidden was now out in the open, and there was no going back. The return home was agonizingly slow. David had left first, not saying a word, his eyes burning with hatred and pain. I watched him drive away, knowing we were headed for disaster. Jack and I followed, the tension between us thick. Inside, I was torn apart by contradictions. I didn't want to lose David. Even after everything, part of me still clung to our marriage. But at the same time, I couldn't deny that I had found something new with Jack, something I hadn't felt in so long with my husband, Dot. When we arrived at the house, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. My heart started pounding. I knew something terrible awaited inside, but I had to go in. I had to try to explain. As I entered the house, my worst fears were confirmed. David was in a rage. He had ripped books from the shelves, scattering them across the room, throwing them onto the floor. Chairs were overturned, one already broken. Shards of glass, probably from a vase, were scattered across the floor. His anger was uncontrollable, and I could see that he wasn't going to stop. "How could you?" His voice was full of despair and fury. He wasn't even looking at me, as if I no longer existed. How could you destroy everything?" I stood in the doorway, not knowing what to say. Deep down, I knew he was right. Our marriage was destroyed and it was my fault. But I couldn't just leave without at least trying to explain. "David, please," I began, tears streaming down my face. "I never wanted it to go this far." He turned to me sharply, his eyes blazing with anger. "You think that comforts me? You think your words change anything? You've already destroyed everything." He knocked another stack of books off the shelf, then shoved a table, sending it crashing to the floor. Jack, who had been standing behind me, stepped forward, trying to intervene. "David, calm down. Let's talk." His voice was quiet but tense, but David, as if not hearing him, spun toward Jack. "You!" he yelled, his face twisted with rage. "How could you? You're my brother. You were supposed to be on my side." Jack raised his hands in an attempt to calm him, but David wouldn't stop. His anger was now directed not only at me, but also at Jack. "You were always there, and I trusted you, and you betrayed me like no one else ever could. How could you, Jack?" His voice trembled with fury and pain. I watched this unfold, feeling my guilt crushing me even more. Tears streamed down my face, and I could barely breathe. Everything I had done had led to this moment. Everything I had tried to hide was now out in the open. My life, my marriage, everything was destroyed. "Please stop," I screamed, unable to bear the scene any longer. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't want to ruin everything." But my words were drowned out by their shouts. David continued to overturn furniture, his rage uncontrollable. He saw nothing but betrayal and pain. At that moment, I realized it was over. No words, no explanations, no attempts at justification could ever bring back what we once had. My marriage was shattered, and that realization hit me with incredible force. Everything I had once valued was gone. We could never be the family we used to be. The apartment was empty, and every corner felt cold and lifeless. David was gone. When he packed his things, there were no words, no goodbyes, just a heavy silence, sharper than any screams. I stood in the hallway, watching him gather the last of his belongings into a suitcase, and I knew it was the end. Everything we had was shattered. When the door closed behind him, the silence wrapped around me like a thick blanket. I realized I was alone, completely alone. The air felt heavier and it became difficult to breathe. I walked to the window, but I saw nothing, just my own reflection in the glass, pale, with dark circles under my eyes and an expression of utter emptiness. There was nothing left. No feelings, no hopes. My betrayal had torn our marriage apart, and I had no one to blame but myself. Days passed in a fog. I didn't know how to move forward. Every corner of the apartment reminded me of the life David and I had built together, of the times when we were happy. Now it all felt distant and insignificant. Everything had been destroyed, and I was left standing among the ruins of that life. One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table trying to pull myself together, I heard a knock at the door. It was a courier with the divorce papers. Papers I had dreaded, but deep down, knew were inevitable. Slowly, I opened the envelope, and the words inside felt like a sentence. Divorce. The word was now a reality. There was no turning back, no chance of fixing what was broken. My heart tightened and tears welled up in my eyes again. It was inevitable, but realizing it hit me harder than I had expected. And then there was Jack. He had changed too. At first, he was there for me, trying to support me, saying we would get through it, that now we had a chance to be together. But with each passing day, I felt something between us shift. Jack began to distance himself. His promises sounded emptier, and I could see the coldness in his eyes growing. One day, when we met at a cafe, I could feel that he was no longer the man I thought I knew. His words were filled with uncertainty, and I understood that he too realized everything had changed. "I don't know, Lauren," he said, staring into his coffee cup. "Everything's different now. This isn't what I expected." I looked at him silently, realizing he was right. Our relationship could never go back to the way it was. We couldn't simply forget what had happened. We had both become prisoners of our mistakes, and now the consequences seemed inevitable. He stood up before I could respond and said, "I think we need some time to figure things out." And at that moment, I realized that even Jack, the one I had risked everything for, was starting to pull away. Everything that had felt so real and passionate was now crumbling like a house of cards. When he left, I was left sitting alone in that cafe, realizing that I had nothing left. My life was a series of broken relationships and mistakes that couldn't be undone. The apartment that had once been filled with life and joy now felt like an empty shell. Every corner reminded me of the past. The books on the shelf, the shared photos I hadn't yet dared to take down. Everything was soaked with memories I could no longer bear. Everything I had known, everything I had built over the years had vanished like smoke. And in this cold silence, I was left alone. Jack no longer called. In the first few days after he said we needed time to think, I still hoped he would reach out, that he would at least try to explain. But his silence was the clearest answer. He wasn't coming back, and that fact was even more painful than the divorce from David. Inside, I felt only emptiness. At first, I thought I could handle it, that with time things would return to normal. But as the days passed, it only got worse. I was losing myself. It felt like with every hour, loneliness grew deeper, wrapping around me like a fog. I stopped leaving the house, avoided friends, afraid to face anyone who would remind me of the past. Even something as simple as going out for groceries seemed like an impossible task. Every corner of this apartment screamed at me about what I had lost. Once, this room had been filled with laughter, with the life David and I had shared. Now, all that was left was an emptiness that became more unbearable with each passing day. I tried not to think about how things could have been different if I had made other choices. Those thoughts drove me insane. I tried to find the strength to move forward. After all, I was still here. Life was supposed to go on. But every time I tried to plan something, the future terrified me. I didn't know what to do next. Every decision felt wrong, every step hopeless. The fear of what was to come paralyzed me. I couldn't take even the smallest step forward. I looked out the window, watching people pass by. It seemed like everyone had their own life, their own plans, their own problems. Everyone but me. Inside, there was nothing but emptiness. I realized I had lost everything. David, Jack, and myself. I sat in this empty house, which had once been my refuge, and didn't know how to live anymore. 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. I was afraid to admit to myself that I might never be able to get my life back on track. All I could see ahead was a fog of fear and uncertainty. A few months had passed since the day I realized my old life was over. At first, it felt like the end of everything I knew, but over time I started to realize that maybe it was just the end of one chapter, not the entire book. I decided to move. The apartment where I had spent so many years with David was filled with memories, of our best and worst moments. Even the walls were soaked with the past. And although the pain of those memories was unbearable, what suffocated me most was the fear of staying in place, clinging to something that was already gone. My new home was entirely different. A small, bright apartment with a view of the park. There were no shadows of the past here, and I could breathe. As I unpacked, I noticed that everything felt foreign and new, as if I were starting my life over. And maybe I was. I no longer had to look back. I began spending more time outside, walking in the park, reading books. These were small steps, but they reminded me that life goes on. Sometimes it was hard not to think about the past, about David, about Jack. They were both gone, each leaving a mark on me. But now I was trying to focus on what I could build on my own. I started working on myself. I decided to go to therapy, to sort through the feelings I had buried for so long. It wasn't easy. But with each new session, I understood that I needed to leave it all behind, that every day was a new opportunity to start fresh. My new self no longer depended on others. I no longer sought approval or tried to justify my mistakes. Ahead of me was a path full of uncertainty, but now I was ready to walk it alone. I realized I had a chance to build something new, something where I could truly be myself. Of course, there were still many questions in this new life. Would I fully heal from everything that had happened? Would I find new meaning in life, a new direction? I didn't know the answers. But now I wasn't as afraid. I knew that no matter how long it took, I would keep moving forward. The ending of this story remained open. My future was uncertain, but it was mine, and that was what mattered most.